Hey guys, welcome back to ToonBlend 3D. Now we're going to go through the UV unwrapping and texturing process for the Cactus Skull Prisoner Character Series. In this video, I also added a few extra improvements, like fixing the belly mesh shape without needing to unwrap again or worrying about texture stretching, and also adding an ambient occlusion layer, plus adjusting the texture saturation to make the colors look more appealing. So yeah, let's get started. First, switch to the UV editing layout. Then set the rig armature to rest position. After that, hide the armature. Right now the character is still using a mirror modifier, so the result will stay symmetrical. If you want different textures on the left and right sides, it's better to apply the mirror modifier first. Next, start selecting edges and use Mark Seam. Select edges in areas that should be separated, like the arms and legs. Think of mark seams like cutting and unfolding a fabric pattern for a doll. The seams decide where the mesh will split, so it can unfold properly into a flat surface. Press L and switch to face select mode to check if the seam selection is correct and not leaking into other parts. To preview the result directly, start unwrapping. Select all faces, press U, then choose Unwrap Angle Based. The result will appear in the UV editor. For the back faces of the head, you can delete them if you want to reduce the vertex count, and use Mark Seam around the border edges if you want to separate the faces. But in this tutorial, I'm not doing either of those. For the head, we'll use Project from View. This method unwraps the mesh based on the current viewport angle, so make sure the view is positioned correctly. Then continue with the other meshes. After that, combine all the UV islands by selecting the faces from every mesh. Then use Average Island Scale. Then use Pack Islands and adjust the margin to add spacing between the UV islands. Make sure all the UV islands are selected. Next, start adjusting the position and size of each UV island. For example, make the head UV larger. In general, increase the size of any UV that needs more texture detail. Here, we'll straighten the rectangular UV shapes using Straighten UVs from the UV Toolkit add-on. Then make the UV stand upright using Straighten Island on the selected UV edge. For the flower UV islands, we'll stack them together. This way, all the flowers will share the same texture, so you only need to paint one flower texture, and the others will follow automatically. Stack them by placing the UV islands in the exact same position. Then select all three UV islands, press M, and choose by distance. After that, adjust the merge distance so the vertices merge properly. Make sure the value is not too high. Otherwise, the vertices can merge incorrectly. Then continue arranging the other UV islands. Next, let's test the UV using a checker map. Adjust the texture size, then choose the checker type. This helps you see how the texture flows across the mesh. For example, the back of the head looks stretched. But since this area doesn't need much detail, I'll leave it as it is. If there are any areas you want to fix, you can redo the marked seams and unwrap the mesh again. Once you're done using the checker map, you can remove the texture, use and remove all checker materials in the Cleanup tab. Next, switch to the texturing layout, then select all the meshes. Before setting up the material, set the character to Shade Smooth. This affects generated layers like Ambient Occlusion, because the shading will influence how the lighting and shadows are calculated. But if you only use pure hand-painted textures with an emission shader, then Shade Smooth will not make much difference, since the texture color is displayed directly without lighting influence. You can also add a subdivision modifier if you want the character to look smoother, but keep in mind, this will increase the vertex count. Next, set up Ucupaint using an emission shader. Enabling alpha is optional. Then press Ctrl+L, then choose Link Material, so all meshes share the same texture material. After that, go to Color Management, then set View Transform to Standard, and set Contrast to None, so the texture colors stay accurate. Now place the reference image on the side of the layout and adjust the opacity. Then create a new image layer for the base color and set the texture resolution. Now, start painting on the character body. You can use Toggle Eraser to remove the paint, or use Reload Image on the layer to completely clear it. Next, add a color palette. Press Shift+X to pick a color sample. Then press left-click to add it to the palette. Then paint the mesh using the fill brush. Then press X to swap between color 1 and color 2, and make sure your cursor is inside the layout area so it works properly. For the head, since it's connected to the body mesh, go into Edit mode and select the head mesh. Then use Paint Mask in Texture Paint mode. This way, only the head area will be painted. Then check every part of the character carefully. If there are colors that don't fill properly, especially around connected areas like the arms, Zoom in and repaint the area. Then continue checking the other parts. Next, let's adjust the base colors using the darkest color from each palette, because it's easier to add highlight colors later than to paint shadow colors inside deep and narrow areas. Next, switch to the soft paintbrush. Start testing the brush, then press F to adjust the brush size. After that, duplicate the base layer for the paint layer. Then choose a highlight color based on the base color. Now, start painting the areas where the highlights would reflect. Make sure not to paint across inner border areas in positions like this. Otherwise, the paint will follow the borders, and the colors won't blend together properly. So make sure the mesh position is comfortable before painting. Then continue by sampling colors around any highlight edges that still look too sharp, and paint over them so the colors blend better with the base color. Next, switch to a brighter highlight color. Then continue blending the colors together like before. Then use paint mask or hide some faces, so the painting process feels more focused and easier to control. While painting, make sure to follow the shape of the character, then continue repeating the same process, while making sure all the colors blend smoothly together. You can turn the character animation back on, so the painting process feels less steering and more enjoyable. Then continue blending any sharp color transitions until they look softer and smoother. Next, create a new layer for the lines. Then enable stylized stroke on the brush, so it's easier to draw clean lines. Now, start drawing lines on the character body, using a dark color based on the base color. For the belly area, make the lines curve to follow the round shape of the body. Then when drawing lines on the back area from the right view, the lines may look warped instead of straight. This happens because the UV faces are stretched. To reduce the problem, redraw the lines from a different angle. Since the line color still looks too strong compared to the body, lower the layer opacity so the lines blend better with the colors underneath. Then add a mask to the line layer to hide some parts of the lines. While using layer masking, use black and white colors. Black hides or fades the lines, while white brings them back. Now start masking, especially on distorted line areas. Next, create a new layer for detailing. Then adjust the opacity like the line layer. Start adding scratches on the line areas, using a darker version of the base color. Then add highlight colors around the edges of the scratches. Make sure the direction matches the main light source on the body. After that, add circular hole patterns on the body, using the same process as the scratches. Then, continue adjusting the masking. Next, you can add paws on the bottom of the hands and feet. The process is the same as painting the body. Start with the base color. Then add highlights in the center to make them look raised. But in this case, I hide them using masking, because they don't look very good and feel a bit uncomfortable to look at. So for the paws, I think they are optional. Or you can improve them yourself, like changing the colors or trying a different design. Next, continue adding highlight details around the line edges of the character. After that, keep refining anything that still feels lacking, like the highlight shading on the body. Next, move on to the face area. Start by adding highlights to the skull, then create the eye circles using a dark body base color. After that, shape the nose hole and the jaw. Then continue adding highlights to the skull, and make sure the colors blend smoothly. Finally, add a few scratches. Next, increase the opacity of the detail and line layers so they stand out more. Now let's start texturing the flower mesh. Here, the top flower texture looks flipped compared to the others. So fix it by flipping the UV. Then continue merging the vertices together. Since the flower mesh already has a texture, we want to keep the UV position unchanged. So pin both flower UV meshes first. Then snap the vertices one by one to match the pinned UV. Once done, go back to texture paint mode. Now, continue painting the flower mesh. Start by adding highlights and make sure the colors blend well. Before continuing with the flower texture, add shadows on the body under the flower mesh. Then, continue adding lines to the flowers. Then, make the center area of the flower darker. After that, add more details, like highlights around the line edges. Then, add some scratches. Next, add stronger highlights around the circle area on the flower tip. Optionally, add small fibers on the tip, and make sure they don't look too contrasted with the surrounding colors. Next, move on to the handcuffs mesh. Start by adding highlights. Then continue with the lines. After that, add scratch details and other small details. Finally, add shadows around the area, especially under the handcuffs. After finishing the texture, let's bake the texture. Use Bake All channels, then set the resolution, and use the same size as the layers to get the exact same result. Next, adjust the sample value. Higher values will make the generated texture look smoother and less jagged. Then enable anti-aliasing and set the value to 2. Then set the margin type to extend. Next, set the bake device. Here I'm using GPU compute. After that, press OK to start baking. The baking process is quite fast here, because we only use pure hand-painted textures without generated layers. Once the baking is finished, you can still edit the layers again if needed. Next, let's improve the belly area so it matches the texture better. First, go into Edit mode, then hide the arms first, before changing the belly shape. Go to the Options menu and enable Correct Face Attributes, so the texture will not stretch when moving vertices. Then enable Keep Connected, so the vertices stay connected in the UV map. After that, adjust the belly vertices until the shape looks better. Make sure to check the center vertices, and make sure the texture still looks correct if it feels difficult to adjust directly on the mesh. You can also edit it from the UV editor. Then continue adjusting the vertices and make sure they stay inside the texture borders. Once finished, go back to texture paint mode. Next, let's add a new layer for ambient occlusion. Actually, we could use generated ambient occlusion, then lower the opacity, so it blends better with the other colors. Using generated ambient occlusion can also help show where shadows should appear, but for now, I'm not using it yet. Instead, let's paint it manually on a new image layer. Create a new image layer for the ambient occlusion. Start adding ambient occlusion from the lower belly area. Use the darker green color from the previous palette. Adjust the strength so it blends smoothly with the other colors, or you can also lower the layer opacity. Then continue adding ambient occlusion behind the lower arm area. Next, move to the handcuff wrist area, then the bottom of the head, and the bottom of the flower. Basically, add it anywhere shadows would naturally appear. Next, move to the flower mesh. Use the darkest flower color from the palette. Then adjust the hue and value to make it slightly darker. After that, start adding ambient occlusion to the lower flower area. Next, move to the handcuffs mesh. Just like before, use the darkest color from the handcuff palette. Then add ambient occlusion to the lower areas and around the connection with the arm, and with that, the main ambient occlusion areas are finished. Then continue improving the handcuffs and add more patterns using the same process as before. Next, continue working on the ambient occlusion. Start by fixing the lower arm area, since it should look darker. Then you can also add ambient occlusion inside the line or scratch details. Continue doing the same on the other meshes. Next, we can add generated ambient occlusion to improve and cover areas that were missing from the manual painting. Then, lower the opacity value. You can also change the color channel mode to soft light or overlay, but here, I'm using multiply, so the character shading does not change too much. But of course, that part is up to you. Next, we can make the texture colors look more vibrant. Add a hue saturation modifier to the color channel. Then adjust the saturation until it looks right. After that, turn the modifier on and off to compare the difference. Next, let's rebake the texture again. Before that, bake the generated ambient occlusion layer first. This helps speed up the final texture baking process, because baking textures with generated layers can take much longer. So by baking the generated layer first, the full texture bake will become much faster. Finally, save the bake texture image. Next, let's do a simple export test to Godot. Before exporting, rename the animation first and enable Fake User in the Action Editor. Then, export the file as .glb. For the export settings, enable Apply Modifiers. Then save it to the folder you want. Next, open Godot. Create a new project, then import the exported file by dragging and dropping it into the project. After that, create a new 3D scene, then drag the character file into the 3D node, then make it to local. After that, select the animation player, and now the character animation can be played. And with that, the full Cactus Skull Prisoner character process is complete. Thank you so much for supporting this channel and watching from the beginning. I hope I can make even better content in the future. Thanks again, and see you next time.